So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for History Happy Hour Murder Mystery. My name is Callie McCune, and I'm the manager of engagement here at the Indiana Historical Society. It's great to have so many people here this evening. I'm going to go over just a few pieces of logistics before I turn the mic over to our speaker. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We do that by collecting paper-based items like books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, maps, and so much more that all tell Indiana's unique stories. Then we find ways to share these, whether that's through publications, exhibitions, or events like this. It's through these documents that we tell the diverse stories of Indiana and inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. Tonight, we're going to look into how you research and tell Indiana stories from a bit of a different lens, through a murder mystery that happened in Mishawaka, Indiana in 1906, and it's a good one. But before I hand it over to our moderator, Dan, and our scholar, Gary, I just have a couple of pieces of logistics to go over. For tonight's event, Gary and Dan will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you do have a question at any point as we go along, please drop it in the question and answer section of your Zoom screen at the bottom, or in the chat feature. We'll keep an eye on those and try to get to as many as we can at the second half of the program. Also, feel free to use your chat box tonight. We want to know what you think and what you have to say, and again, what questions you have. Just don't forget to change your response to all panelists and attendees. That way everyone can see your thoughts. And keep an eye on that chat. I'll be dropping in links and URLs as we go along. Don't worry if you miss one. I know it can be hard to catch them all. We'll deliver them to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow. And just if you didn't hear the lovely lady on Zoom, this program is being recorded. You'll be able to catch the replay on our website, indiana.org, in the upcoming weeks. If you enjoyed this program, we hope you'll consider coming back for more. We have one last History Happy Hour of the year on December 9th, when we'll talk to Nell Hodges about Santa Claus, Indiana. You'll be able to find information on how to sign up for that at indianahistory.org just at the start of next week. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Shockley. He's the creative director for exhibitions and audience experience at the Indiana Historical Society to get us started. Hey, Dan, thanks for being here tonight.
My pleasure. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Gary Sosnicki. Gary's a retired journalist who worked in 4 states before retiring after 43 years in the business. He's received dozens of awards for journalism excellence, including the Eugene Cervi Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society of Weekly Newspaper Editors. Gary was inducted into the Missouri Press Association Hall of Fame in 2014, and he is the author of the book we're going to discuss tonight. You can see it there over his shoulder. The Potato Masher Murder, Death at the Hands of a Jealous Husband. Gary, it's great to see you.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's great to be part of the program tonight.
Well, welcome to History Happy Hour, and my happy hour drink is a watered down, about 6-hour-old Diet Coke. What are you enjoying tonight?
Well, I'm drinking iced tea. There are 3 beverages that are mentioned in the book, and I thought about this, what I should be drinking tonight. There's coffee cocktails, there's brandy, there's coffee that may or may not have poison in it, so I suppose I would be better off, more authentic if I was drinking coffee tonight without the poison. However, I would probably spill coffee if I was drinking it, so I think having iced tea with a cap is the smart way to go.
That's great. Well, tell us a little bit about your career and what led you maybe to write a book about crime.
Well, Dan, I worked for daily newspapers in Tennessee and Southern Illinois before my wife and I bought the first of 3 weekly newspapers in Missouri starting in 1980. I ran a weekly newspaper in Kansas after we sold our first newspaper, and Helen and I published a small daily newspaper in Missouri after we sold our second newspaper. So except for 3 years when I was a sports editor, I covered crime as a reporter. And even when we owned our own newspapers, I was doing my own reporting. So often that involved gaining the trust of rural sheriffs and police chiefs that my reporting would be factual. So on my first job in Tennessee, I visited the sheriff's office every morning for 6 months before the sheriff would even talk to me. But eventually I had full access to his criminal files. In Southern Illinois, I covered 2 state prisons and helped cover a prison break at the infamous U.S. penitentiary at Marion. In Missouri, I covered the 1984 murder of a small town mayor, a case that even made the cover of Parade magazine. And I wrote 2 stories on that for the Dallas Times-Herald. So it was a nationally known murder. And Helen and I covered the 1989 murder of a 24-year-old woman who was abducted while mowing a rural church cemetery. The prime suspect even walked into our office one Wednesday afternoon wanting to be interviewed. So 32 years later, that case remains unsolved. So writing a book about a murder was right up my alley.
Wow. So you've written about some pretty intense stories over the years. And
Yeah.
I would imagine that, here you are in the middle of, the research for the stories and things like that, but you can't become personally involved. Is that correct?
Well, right. Ordinarily, you can't. And in this case, I could.
How so?
Well, the victim was my great-grandmother, Cecilia Henderson Hornberg Ludwig. So that really made it a personal story for me.
Wow. So you covered and wrote about your own great grandmother's
Right.
murder.
Yeah.
What was that like? You know, what brain were you using? Were you using your family brain? Were you using your reporter brain? I mean, a mix of the two.
Well, when you're a reporter, you try to be objective, and I tried to be objective in writing this, and it wasn't like I knew her or anything because she died. The murder was in 1906, and I was born in 1951, so it wasn't a right brain left brain thing. I just tackled it like I would a regular newspaper story, but of course it was a lot longer.
Wow. Well, let's jump into this particular crime. Tell me about the murder. How does it all start?
Well, really, it starts the night before when Albin Ludwig, and that's the second husband of my great grandmother, Albin, and that's Albin with a B as in boy, not V. And when and you see his prison shot, mugshot there, when Albin follows Cecilia, his wife, and Jean, her adult sister, follows them downtown because he thinks they're seeing men. And they do. They do see 2 men that night. One fella by the name of Ackerman, and then another fellow by the name of Fred Young, who'd been hanging out at the house a lot. And Albin suspects that that Cecilia's having affairs with both men. But in my own mind, perhaps that Fred was more interested in Jean than in Cecilia. But that happened the night before. Then and there's quarreling. Fred comes back to the house. There's quarreling all evening. But the next morning there's more quarreling. Cecilia tells Albin she wants to leave. They want to break up the marriage. Jean is also leaving because there's so much tension in the house. Cecilia says, "Okay, I'm going to go with you." And she says, "I would leave, except I don't have any place to pack my clothes, anything to put it in." So Albin gives her a trunk to pack, and he says, "I don't really want you to leave, but if you're going to leave, here's a trunk." So there's quarreling. All right, so let's fast forward. The about 1:30 in the afternoon, neighbors see smoke coming out of the upstairs of their 2-story house in Mishawaka. It's on Marion Street in Mishawaka near the railroad tracks, and neighbors see smoke coming out of the west window, and they call the fire department. The fire chief goes to the upstairs bedroom where the smoke is coming from, and he realizes the fire is inside the closet. He opens the closet door and sprays water into the roof because the fire was burning a hole in the roof. Then he discovers, the smoke clears, he discovers on the closet floor the nude, charred body of Cecilia Ludwig. All her clothes had been burned off except for some metal corset stays. He would testify later, and I love this quote, her flesh looked just about like a real hard-baked chicken. Meanwhile, neighbors have climbed through a window above the porch and have discovered Albin, the husband, seemingly unconscious on the bedroom floor. He was bleeding from razor wounds to his throat, arms, and legs. So you have a dead wife and a seriously injured husband, and investigators have to piece together how they ended up that way.
Wow. So, okay, so Albin is Cecilia's second husband.
Right.
And Jean is Cecilia's sister.
Yes.
Okay. Who are some of the other key players in the story so that, as we get further into it, we can keep everybody straight?
Okay. Well, Jean was one of 4 Henderson girls. 5 if you count the one who was born before the marriage. And Jean had been living in the house with her 2 young children since most of the summer. She was supposed to be paying $10 a month rent, but apparently had not been paying any rent yet. So then you have Fred Young, who is a young widower who is from the same small town as Cecilia and Jean, which is Kingsbury, Indiana, which is just south of LaPorte. Albin suspects that Fred is one of several men having affairs with Cecilia. You have neighbors like Fred Metzler and Marcellus Gaze, whom Albin confides in about his marital troubles. And a lot of marital troubles, a lot of quarreling going on. You have 2 men with small but important roles in the story. You have Ackerman, the bridge man, and his first name is lost to history, but that's who Albin sees Cecilia and Jean talking to that night when they went to downtown Mishawaka, and he was surreptitiously following him. And then you have Smoke Minen, and we're not sure if that was a nickname, Smoke, and we're not sure if the last name was Minen or Miner, but he is someone who was a boarder at the house, and Albin found him one morning in a closet in his bedroom with Cecilia hiding from him. And Albin never specifically said what their state address was, but his implication was that they were in a state of undress when he found the 2 of them in the closet. So he suspects that both Ackerman and Smoke Minen have had affairs with Cecilia, among other ones. So they are characters. And then you got the fire chief, you got the police chief, you got the lawyers, you got Albin's brother Gustav, who served in prison the same time as Albin, but Gustav was just a burglar. Albin was convicted of murder. And then the cast of characters at the beginning of the book, I think I list over 100 names.
Wow. Okay, so here we are, 1906. There's been a fire in the house. Cecilia is dead in the closet, burned. Her body is burned. And Albin is possibly unconscious, but definitely injured. So yes. Now, who gets to tell the story of what happened?
Well, there are no witnesses other than Albin, and possibly one of Cecilia's children, a 6-year-old boy who the LaPorte newspaper reported later that he may have witnessed it. So we just know what the theories of the case are. So I'm going to start with the prosecution theory, Dan, which was that the couple had been quarreling, the marriage was breaking up, that Albin grabbed a wooden potato masher. And I don't know how many of the viewers tonight have seen an old-fashioned wooden potato masher like this, which if you swing it like a baseball bat, you could really do damage to it. So the prosecution theory was that Albin grabbed a wooden potato masher, chased Cecilia up the stairs, knocked her unconscious, poured gasoline or kerosene on her, then set her on fire. The prosecution believed that Elbin closed the closet door, put a chair in front of it, then sliced himself up with a razor to make it look like self-defense. Now, Elbin's story was that Cecilia may have poisoned his coffee at the noon meal and that he went upstairs feeling ill. He laid down on the bed. And as he was laying on the bed, he realized, oh my gosh, I've got a life insurance policy that benefits Cecilia. So he thinks he's dying from this poison. Now, this is his story. This is the defense story. So he was looking for the policy in Cecilia's trunk when Cecilia comes upstairs and she's wielding the potato masher. So you see, the potato masher is involved in both theories. So they argue vehemently about the division of property, and I mean, there are cuss words being used in this. And Cecilia isn't happy with Elbin's answers, and she takes a swing at him. Well, Warden works off the blow, grabs Cecilia by the neck, pushes her against the wall where her head hits a wire hook. Again, this is the defense theory. So in the prosecution theory, you've got Cecilia being hit on the head and knocked unconscious with a potato masher. In the defense theory, you've got her being choked and getting a head injury from hitting a wire hook. So then how did she burn? Well, Elbin's story is that a kerosene lantern fell. There was no light in the closet other than a kerosene lantern. It fell, and that set her on fire. So Elbin's story was believable up to the point where the kerosene lantern fell. He claimed he couldn't remember anything after that, which to me means he couldn't explain how he acquired all those razor wounds.
Wow. So two very, very different stories.
Yeah.
Where do you fall? Where in your research did you fall in terms of what part of whose story did you believe?
Well, I believe the prosecution theory. There is no doubt in my mind that Elbin killed my great grandmother, but there are just so many questions about it still in my mind, and I come up with more questions every time I read my own book. You know, who wielded the potato masher? That's a good question. Was there poison in the coffee cup? Elbin did suffer throat wounds from drinking poison. So either there was poison in the coffee cup, or he drank poison in order to, as part of his suicide effort. So there are a lot of questions in my mind about that. But I do believe there's no doubt in my mind that Elbin's the one who killed her.
And I don't want to give away everything in the book, certainly, but so you do believe it was a suicide attempt, or do you think there was some just trickery and, oh, I'm so injured type of thing?
Well, he, I think he, I don't know whether it was a real suicide attempt or whether he was just trying to prove that it was, show that it was self-defense. The throat wound, the arm wounds are superficial. The wound to his leg, to his calf, was 3.5 inches deep. So that was either a mistake or whatever. There was the danger of gangrene in the hospital. He was in the hospital for quite a while after this. So you know, I'm just not sure.
Sure. So a lot of what Elbin says paints a very unflattering picture of your great grandmother. How much of that do you think is warranted? How much of that do you think is story to help him with his case?
I think Cecilia was portrayed accurately. No one deserves to be murdered, and yes, she was the victim of domestic violence in both of her marriages. But I believe Cecilia was flirtatious and probably promiscuous. She had a foul mouth and a temper almost as bad as Elbin's. She could give as much as she could take. And really, there are no heroes in this story.
Wow. So we've talked about Alvin and Cecilia, and so now talk a little bit, please, about the family tree involved in, Cecilia's children, which one of your children was your grandfather, correct?
Yeah, yeah. So you've got the Henderson family, which was Cecilia's family. They immigrated from Scotland and settled in LaPorte County, and Cecilia married when she was 15 and 7 months pregnant, and married her first husband, Charlie Hornberg. And she was pregnant with my grandfather, William. And 2 years later, she had a second child, Lyle. And the marriage broke up 7 months after Lyle was born.
And Lyle's a girl, correct?
Lyle was a girl. Yeah.
Okay. So when did you first hear about this story? Did you hear about it from your family? Did you discover it on your own? Is it something your family would talk about?
My family whispered about the murder at family gatherings, and my brother and I have talked about this, and it was kind of cryptic discussions. And Cecilia was never spoken of in a complimentary manner. She was referred to as kind of sarcastically as Miss Indiana or the Beauty Queen, and which I understand, because of course my great grandfather remarried, and to my mother, my great grandfather's second wife was who she knew as her grandfather. But so Dale and I really didn't know any details about this. So it wasn't until 1996 that my mom told me enough that I could start researching the case.
So talk a little bit about that research. What has family research, meant to you?
Well, it certainly has kept me busy for part of it. I started researching in 1996, back at what I consider the birth of the public use of the internet. When we all got the AOL discs in the mail, and I found one when I was cleaning up a closet that I still had unopened. So we all started family research, and that's when I wrote. I discovered who would do history research in LaPorte, because my mom thought that it happened in LaPorte, which was her father's hometown. So she thought it happened, I think, in the year before 1904. I think she thought it happened in LaPorte. So I typed a letter to Fern Eddy Schultz, who and I just found out yesterday that she had passed in this March. But I typed a letter to her back in 1996 and asked if she could find any newspaper clippings on it, and she couldn't. So I talked to my mom again, and we decided maybe it was a different year. And Fern did find clippings from 1906 in Mishawaka, and she sent me a half dozen clippings from microfilm from the LaPorte newspapers, and she did some more research for me. She sent me the divorce decree, which she found, and she sent me a list of what other documents were available in the LaPorte County Courthouse. And then she connected me with another person who had been contacting her about the same case, and that was Paula Steiner of California, whom I didn't know existed, but she turned out to be a distant cousin. And Paul is the one who supplied that photo of Cecilia that you just saw on the slides here just a little bit ago. So that's how I got started. And then I got sidetracked because I was looking into the other side of my family, and I was in the newspaper business at the time, but I was busy. But I was looking at the other side of my family. I discovered a Sosnicki in Denmark. And it turned out that this fella, the Sosnicki in Denmark, spoke English, fortunately. His grandfather left the same small town in Poland about the same time that I did. So Cecilia got pushed aside for years while my newfound cousin in Denmark and I were doing research trying to figure out where the link was between us. So it wasn't until I retired in 2016 that I started working again, that I picked up the Cecilia murder case. And then it wasn't until I slipped and broke my ankle 6 months into retirement, and I had no choice but to stay homebound for a couple of months. So I was interviewed by the columnist for the South Bend Tribune, and I told her that story, and she said, "Well, I guess that means that the key to success for an author is to break your ankle." I said, "That is correct."
But you wouldn't advise it, probably.
I wouldn't advise it, but that did get me that did get me going on this story.
That's great. Are there any other organizations or individuals that really kind of helped you with pieces of the puzzle?
Yeah, besides Fern, Judy, who is supervisor of the Mishawaka Penn Harris Library Heritage Center, she was our host twice as Helen and I reviewed microfilm of the Mishawaka and South Bend newspapers, which were not digitized. Maybe they are now, but they weren't in 2016. And there's a large collection of city directories at the Mishawaka Library. And Deanna also found the actual fire department log for the day of the fire. She found a photograph of a hook and ladder truck that the fire department was using at that time. So she was very helpful. Ellen Anderson of the St. Joseph County Library found 4 important photos that are in the book. The Elkhart and LaPorte libraries, the LaPorte County Historical Society also helped. But Michael Vettman is my hero. Michael is the reference archivist for the Indiana State Archives, and he tracked down the trial transcript for me in the Indiana Supreme Court files. We had stopped at the St. Joseph County Archives, which is a warehouse, and had asked about a trial transcript from a 1907 murder trial. And the person there said, we dispose of felony cases after 55 years. So that was really a low point in my research. But I'd been corresponding with Michael on prison mugshots, which you can buy from they're called Indiana Images, and they're through the archives. And I asked him if he's ever in the Indiana Supreme Court files, because the case was appealed to the Supreme Court. So Michael called me and said, "Mr. Sosnicki, I've got it." So that was terrific. And he also found an abstract of the trial testimony that was very helpful. And he supplied a copy of a 7½ page description of the crime, handwritten by Elman when he entered prison. So I mean, that was really incredible to have that.
So as you know, here at the Indiana Historical Society, we collect the paper of Indiana's history is kind of a way to boil it down. And so, like you're talking about, those documents, once they're gone, they're gone.
Yeah.
And so are there, I mean, you just named several. Is there a favorite? Is there a favorite picture or a document that you thought, wow, what a great thing that this still exists?
Well, the transcript had to be my favorite. And we had to wear cotton gloves to examine it. And of course, you're not allowed to stick it on a photocopier. But Michael did allow us to take cell phone photos of the pages. So and you see on the screen there, that's the verdict. So we're going through this, and we are taking photo. It's 1.5 inches thick. You can't take a photograph of every page, not when you're in town for one day. So we're taking photographs of the key testimony, which would be Elman's, and we had the abstract, which had summarized testimony on that. So all of the major characters, we took photographs. And then after I write the first draft, I'm embarrassed because I've realized that there are multiple attorneys on both sides. There are 3 prosecution attorneys and 2 defense attorneys. And in every case, I do not know which attorney was asking the questions. So we had to go back to Indianapolis, which is a 6-7 hour drive, and spend another day identifying which attorney asked each question to each witness. So that that was fun, but we really appreciated that document. That was so important to us.
Wow. So in all this research, you know, some of the folks you're related to in the story, some of the folks you're not. Is there a favorite person that you kind of uncovered in this, or somebody that really kind of resonated with you personally?
Well, you know, as a journalist, my favorite character is Peter Young, and he was the Mishawaka correspondent for the South Bend Daily Times. He definitely was my favorite. There were some days he could fill a whole page talking about the murder. Some of it wasn't accurate. There was a lot of speculation, but he covered the story more intensely than any of the other newspapers. And there were a lot of newspapers that covered this case. Both of the daily papers in South Bend covered it. Both of the daily newspapers in Elkhart covered it. Both of the daily newspapers in LaPorte covered it. The Mishawaka Enterprise covered it. So there were a lot of papers that covered it. But Peter did such a great job, and I was so pleased that you had a vignette on Peter's at the whodunit the other night. Even though Peter was out of the office at the time, I was pleased for that. And I even wrote this week, there's on my Facebook author page, I wrote a little story about Peter Young. He had a tragic ending to his life too, but that's not in the book.
Wow. So several newspapers covered the story.
Yeah.
And there were multiple attorneys on each side. Do you get the impression that this case was a big deal, or was this just kind of, oh, another crime in the area?
This was a big deal at the time. This was page one news, off and on for well, the murder happened in September and the trial was in April for not quite a year, but from September to April, there were a lot of stories, a lot of trees killed for newsprint to report on the murder. The Elkhart paper was terribly interested in the story because Albin and his Albin had come from Elkhart. The family, the Ludwig family, were German immigrants who had settled in Elkhart, but Elkhart had come from Elkhart. He and Cecilia lived briefly in Elkhart until they were booted out of their Albin's mother's house after Cecilia had struck his mother, and then 10 days later struck his sister-in-law. So anyway, they were a well-known family in Elkhart. So LaPorte, of course, Kingsbury just south of LaPorte. So they were very interested in the case. And of course, the Mishawaka paper, that's where it happened. In South Bend, was the daily paper that also served Mishawaka. So everyone was interested in the case. It was a big deal.
Wow. Well, I've got a few more questions for you, but I want to make sure I say to the audience, if you have questions, please submit those in either the Q&A or the chat, and Callie will take care of that for us. But I want to ask you now, what became of Cecilia's son and daughter?
Well,
how old were they when the crime happened, and what became of them?
William, the son, was 14. He was living with his father, Charlie, and I believe they were living in Cassopolis. Is that how you pronounce it? In Michigan, Cassopolis. And Grandpa Hornberg married about 10 years after the murder. He had one child, my mother. We were very close to that side of the family. He took me fishing for perch at Lake Marie, Illinois, and which Grandma would cook when we got back to Chicago. And once he bought, and this is a favorite memory, he bought front row box seats for us right behind home plate at Wrigley Field so we could watch the Cubs together. What he didn't figure was that my grandma could watch that game on WGN and she could count the number of beers that he drank that day. And he was not supposed to be drinking. And we did stop at a tavern on the way into Wrigley Field. So yeah, he was not supposed to be drinking, but
that's hilarious.
For beers. Oh, the daughter Lyle. Yeah.
Yes.
The daughter Lyle, she was raised by her grandparents in Kingsbury. She did live periodically with Albin and Cecilia. I I believe that she was in school on the day of the murder, but that was only mentioned once. I've written that she's in school. There's always the possibility that that one source was wrong. I know that a few months earlier, a neighbor had written, the grandmother had written Christina Henderson and said that you need to get this girl back home because there's no one here to take care of her. The mother is out gadding about town. So Lyle married in 1913. She raised a family, and she died in LaPorte 2 months short of her 102nd birthday.
Wow.
So she died in 1996. And Dan, I have just thought of this recently. You know, my mom didn't talk about this until 1996. And I wonder if one of the reasons she didn't talk about it was because Lyle was still alive. And maybe she knew that Lyle had died, and that's when she felt a little more comfortable talking about it. I don't know. Just speculation.
It's amazing what families will not share among themselves.
And this was the case with the distant cousins who I found, who helped me with the book. And it was the case with the Ludwig family members who helped me with the book. They were all of my generation and or one generation behind. And they, in most cases, nobody knew anything about the murder. Some of them were doing their own research. And of course, they helped me with my research, but they all wanted to know about the case.
So you've had contact with the Ludwig family.
Yeah.
What happened to Albin? And did he get out of jail? Did he remarry? Did he ever have a family again?
Well, he was convicted of second-degree murder and had a sentence of life in prison. But my research of wife murders, and I found it interesting going through the old newspapers that the newspapers just that was a term, wife murder, and I found that the wife murders in that first decade of the 20th century in Indiana, if they didn't hang you, you got out after 16 years, regardless of what the sentence was. And Albin got out after 16 years, even with a life sentence. So he was sponsored by a policeman when he got out, an Elkhart policeman. He went back to Elkhart, and he worked in the restaurant business. According to city directories, he worked in the restaurant business and may have even owned a restaurant for a time in Elkhart. During World War II, he went to work at of course, he was too old to serve. He went to work at a metal company that made, oh gosh, I can't remember what they made, but they were making materials in the war effort. And at that time, he was quite old. He died in 1954, and that was incredibly hard to find because there was no obit in the Elkhart Truth newspaper. And I looked online, and we went and looked in person at microfilm at the Elkhart Library. No obit. He's buried in an unmarked grave in Rice Cemetery, which is not the cemetery that the rest of the Ludwig family is in. So your speculation is that the family was ashamed of Albin, which they certainly should be, because there was an unmarked grave. It's in a cemetery different from the rest of the Ludwig family, and there was no obit in the newspaper. And I wouldn't have known that if one of the Ludwig descendants, and since there were no children, it would have been a descendant of one of the other Ludwigs, had done her own research, and she found that information in a book published by a Elkhart funeral home of deaths that funeral home had handled.
Well, and that kind of brings up a good point about obituaries. Obituaries are such an amazing tool in terms of research, and we're now in an age where obituaries cost to put into a newspaper often. And
yes.
So some families are opting not to put those obituaries in, which is a shame, because as you talk about leaving a paper trail of a person behind in 100 years, you want to look them up. We're really going to miss obituaries.
Yeah, one of my best friends, and he's a former journalist, and he was my boss for a while, and he's also a published author. We agree that we would not charge for obituaries, but I understand that the newspaper industry, things are changing so much, and they do have to charge in order to. Those that are charging, I understand they need the revenue. I like what our newspaper, our regional daily newspaper in Springfield, Missouri is doing, and you pay for the full obit, but there is a list of deaths every day, and the funeral home and the town and the date, so that if you were doing research, you at least you had a place to start. You could go to the funeral home or something, get that information. I had a journalism history professor at the University of Missouri School of Journalism by the name of Dr. William Howard Taft. So I assume he was born during the Taft administration. And Dr. Taft, Bill Taft, he taught us that newspapers are a tool for historians, and it's really sad that what is happening, you don't have birth announcements anymore. They're all on Facebook. You don't have weddings and engagements. There's so few of them in the newspapers. And as you mentioned, the pay death announcement. So this is a tragedy coming up for historians and for all of us, and especially as newspapers, if many newspapers cease to exist, which could happen.
Absolutely. I want to make one more call out for questions to come in. You can submit those through the Q&A or the chat, and Callie will send those our direction. I have one more question for you before we get into the questions that are coming in. So last week and for several years, we have done an event we call Who Done It, where we turn our building, and a lot of the folks on here tonight, Gary, with us, actually came to the Who Done It last week, and we turn our building into essentially a multi-story level clue game using an actual Indiana crime. And so this past Friday, it was Gary's potato masher murder story. Gary, first of all, thank you for talking to us, allowing us to tell this story in this way, and wanted to know kind of what you thought of the idea when we presented it to you.
Oh, I was thrilled. It was an incredible event. I presented 34 programs in 9 states about this book, including 2 others this week. And I've been interviewed by newspapers and even on Los Angeles radio. I've been on several true crime podcasts, plus this program tonight. But nothing has been as exciting as the Who Done It last Friday night. It was just an incredible experience. The actors were accurate with what they were saying. They were being careful not to give away too much information unless the person asked a question that was related to the additional information. The actress playing my great grandmother, I had a hoot dealing with her and introducing myself to her. She was hilarious. So, and hopefully we sold some books because of it.
Good. Yeah, our guests are able to come in and be detectives for the night and interview suspects and possible victims and attorneys, or maybe any number of characters involved in a story to be able to figure out who done it. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. We've really had a great time working with you on it. So I've got some audience questions for you, Gary.
I'm ready.
All right. One of the questions is about the house.
Yes.
Kind of where was the house? Is the house still standing? What part of Mishawaka was it in?
It's on the north, or what was the north side of Mishawaka at that time in 1906. It would be the north edge. At that time was the Grand Trunk Railroad tracks. Today, if you're on Main Street north of the river, you'll see a railroad bridge, which wasn't there in 1906. And East Marion Street is cut off today from Main Street, which at that time was known as Bridge Street. So it wasn't until both sides of Main Street were paved on that river that it became North Main Street. So it was on East Marion Street. The railroad tracks ran behind the house. There were only 5 houses on that side of the street. So it was a brand new neighborhood. The house still exists. I will tell you that the more time I spend on the book, writing it, and since it was published, the more confused I am about which house it was. Because the house numbers changed between the murder and the trial. All right. So what's in the newspapers are not exactly not necessarily the address for the house today. The key, and you don't know whether I don't know whether they could have changed another time. The key is it 2 stories? Does it have a porch? Does it have a double window at the top of above the porch? And that's what confused me. The first trip we made, and I'll be careful how I say this, we staked out what we thought was the house and surprised the owner. I will be careful how I say this, who was not real pleased when I told him my purpose. But eventually he calmed down enough to invite me in the house. So if that's the house, I have been in the closet where Cecilia was killed. But as time passes, I think, well, it could be the house next door. And this week, I'm looking at more pictures of that street, and I'm wondering, there's a third house that's very similar construction. I wonder if it's that house. So I don't know, but it does exist. Whichever one it is, it does exist.
Okay. Here's another question. So we're in 1906, and I think a lot of times we think about married couples in that time as being, you marry young and you're faithful and you stay together forever. And yet this story has, some infidelity and cheating and things like that. What was that looked upon at that time? Any differently than today? Was it more hush hush?
Well, in this case, it certainly wasn't hush hush. And I found it interesting that Indiana called itself the divorce. Well, this was a court official called Indiana the divorce mill of the United States, because there were so many divorces in Indiana during that first decade of the 20th century. And I'm going to lose my train of thought here because I got sidetracked on the divorce mill. But there was a story. Yeah, here's what I wanted to say. Ironically, there was a story in the South Bend newspaper, one of the South Bend newspapers, on the day of the murder, and it was called The Modern Woman. And that story was a syndicated story, because if you do a search on that story, you'll find it in newspapers, in English language newspapers all over the place. I found one copy in Australia. And that talked about how women were changing and they were more independent. And I write about that in the epilogue of the book. So I think Cecilia was ahead of her time. She was a modern woman. And I will be honest with you, the Henderson girls, all 4 of those Henderson girls were married multiple times and had plenty of kids. So things were starting to change around 1906.
Wow. I'm putting out a last call for questions. I've got a few more I want to give, but if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll try to get to all of them. So when we did Whodunit, one of the options for a possible suspect was a lover. Was there any indication of a third party involved in the crime at all, or anything of that nature?
I have 2 close friends who are here in my town, Lebanon, Missouri, and in Rotary with me, who have read the book. In fact, one of them was one of my beta readers who read the first draft and advised me. And both of them think that a boyfriend was responsible for the razor wounds on Albert. that there was a third person involved, at least in that case, that perhaps Albin had killed Cecilia, but that the boyfriend came upon the scene and cut up Albin in retaliation for what had happened to Cecilia. Now, that's what makes me think that while I wish we had fingerprint technology back then, so that among other things, many things that I wish we had in the case, that the razor, the bloody fingerprints on the razor could have been identified, could have been matched with who held that razor.
Here's another question that came in. So Albin seemingly was buried without any fanfare.
Yeah.
Do we know who paid for his burial? Was it a pauper funeral, or is that information just lost to history?
We do not know. I would suspect it was a pauper because of the grill, the gravestone not having any name on it. So that would be my assumption.
Okay. And is there any indication of later in Albin's life, any remarks he might have made about Cecilia? Any talk about the crime?
There were a couple of anecdotes from relatives who one relative thought that he had remarried. I can find no evidence that Albin had remarried, but at least he was seen with a woman, and apparently the family member stopped him on the street and yelled at the woman and said, "You don't know what kind of man you're dealing with," something like that. There was another instance where supposedly he was a door-to-door salesman at one point. And again, I've got no evidence of it other than just anecdotal. And that I guess it was Lyle. Maybe Lyle was living there, but one of the family members was living there and would be scared to death whenever he came to the neighborhood. So I have anecdotes like that, but that's it. He stayed out of trouble. There's no evidence that he was arrested for anything while he was out.
And did you have any reaction, any negative reaction while you were writing, now that the book has been published? Any negative reaction or reactions from either side of the family?
No, I think we are one generation removed from where any family member would be upset by the book. We're 3 generations down the road now, so we're curious about what really happened. And I joke that my mom, if she were still alive, she'd be proud that I wrote a book, but she would be embarrassed that her neighbors would know this dark family secret.
Sure.
And my response to that would be, well, that's okay, Mom, that the children of all your neighbors have bought the book and read it.
That's great. Where is Cecilia buried?
Cecilia is buried in Kingsbury Cemetery. There actually are 2 stones. She's buried under the name Cecilia Hornberg on the one stone, which I find interesting. If you're not going to call her Ludwig, then why didn't you call her Henderson on the stone? But she's called Cecilia Hornberg on the one stone. And then there is a big stone that has mother and father and then daughter with Cecilia, and the death date on that stone is 2 days off. And so I'm sure the family had a lot of things on its mind when they did that, or maybe that stone was done years later by other members of the family and they didn't have the correct death date for Cecilia.
Have you been to the grave?
Yeah, a couple times. Yeah.
Do you feel, this is a great grandmother you never knew, who died many, many years before you were born. You didn't really hear about her as a kid.
Yeah.
Do you feel close to her now?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I'm close to her in that I know her life story. Am I emotionally close to her? I'm still a journalist who tries to look at things objectively, and I'm willing to give Albin the benefit of the doubt on his stuff. So I'm not sure that I feel emotionally close to her, but certainly she has become a part of my life particularly the last 5.5 years, 4 years of writing 12 drafts of the book and finding a publisher, and then the last 1.5 years talking about it. So she's a part of the life that way.
And so it's almost Halloween.
Yeah.
So I have to ask, does anybody ever claim to you a ghost sighting of Cecilia or anyone involved in the story?
You know, that day that on our first trip to Mishawaka, when we were staking out, waiting for the owner of the house, what we perceived to be the house, and I'm not sure it's the house now, but when we were staking out the house, there were folks on the porch of the house to the west. And I started talking to them about why I was there and talking about the murder and so forth. And she said, well, you know, we have a ghost in our house. And I said, really? And I said, ask her if she's Sicilian, and say that her and if she says yes, that her great grandson is looking for her.
We just had a question pop up kind of along that line. It's, what did you think of Mishawaka?
Oh, it's a nice city. And you know, I didn't know until after we had left the last time that I had a Portillo's hot dog place. And you know, growing up in Chicago and eating Chicago dogs at the very first Portillo's, that is first on my list on our next trip to Mishawaka, is going to Portillo's and getting a Chicago dog.
Well, when you go, get the cake shake, which is exactly what it sounds like. Have you had one?
No, I haven't. No.
It's a piece of chocolate cake and a shake. It's crazy, but it's delicious. Well, Gary, I can't thank you enough. This was great. And here's Callie.
Thank you guys so much for this great conversation. It's been a blast. And as someone that has read the Potato Masher Murder cover to cover, I always learn something new when I talk to Gary.
So do I. Every time I read it, I learn something.
We'll say that if you want a copy of this book, I put the link in the chat and we'll put that in your email. That'll come to your inbox tomorrow, so you can get yourself a copy. Gary will also be at IHS's Holiday Author Fair on December 4th. So if you live in the area of Indianapolis, come on down, get it signed, and talk to Gary about the murder. So thank you again so much for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed this program, we hope you consider coming back for more. As I mentioned on the top of the program, we have one more History Happy Hour of the year that'll take place on December 9th. And we have a number of great events coming up, from the opening of our Festival of Trees Winter Extravaganza in just 2 weeks. Dan's been installing Christmas trees all day. To events on Indigenous people, film, suffrage, and more. Some are online, some are in person. So check out indianahistory.org or the link that Bethany just put in the chat, and you can find out more. We'll post this conversation to YouTube and our website in the upcoming weeks. In the meantime, if you'd like to revisit any of our previous free programs, you can hear History Happy Hours about underwear, donuts, pirates, and a ton of other topics. You can find that on our YouTube playlist or in the link that will be coming at you in the chat in just a moment. You'll get an email from us tomorrow morning with all of these links and a survey included. It'll take you 1 minute. We'd love to know what you thought and how to make events like this better in the future. And lastly, if you missed your chance to donate or would like to make a further gift to the Indiana Historical Society, please consider visiting the link that will appear in the chat in just a moment. That allows us to continue to share Hoosier stories and offer these free programs. So with that, I hope you stay safe and stay healthy, and we can't wait to see you at an event virtually or in person in the future. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.